The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Debt is up, but savings are also up. COVID-19 has thrown all the usual financial considerations for a loop, and tonight we're looking at that. First, we'll learn about Canadians' changed perception of debt. Then we'll hear from economists about whether the post-COVID era will be defined by spending, belt-tightening, or runaway inflation. It's Monday, April 5th, and that's next on The Agenda. Debt for many is a four-letter word. Older generations saw it as a terrifying burden, but that's not exactly so for younger generations. Sean Stack is Vice President of the insolvency practice Bromwich and Smith. He joins us now from Calgary, Alberta, on how our relationship with debt has changed. Hi, Sean. It's very nice to meet you.
It's lovely to be here, my friend.
Your firm recently conducted a national survey to take the pulse of, quote, Canadian compassion on debt forgiveness. Here are some of the responses from the Debt Cost Tracker on the perceptions of why people get into debt. Sheldon, could you please bring in the board? Top responses include, because people chose more than one category, it adds up to more than 100%. 42% say it's lack of financial literacy. 41% say cost of living increases. 40% unexpected financial emergencies, such as a car accident, divorce, major health problem, a lawsuit, or a natural disaster. And 36% say job loss. You know, I thought the survey was really interesting because you wanted to examine empathy and stigma around debt. How come?
Well, because the vision of my firm is really, it's not just about providing the solution that's available to Canadians under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act. It's actually about normalizing the conversation of debt within the community. And part of what we're about is recognizing the social and emotional impacts of debt within the community. So it's not just about solving the manifestation of the overburdenment of debt, but it's actually kind of getting to the root of it so we can kind of change the community dialogue and start removing some of that stigma.
Maybe I am divulging too much information, but, after university, I had a debt collector calling me, but I don't remember empathy being part of those conversations.
Well, and unfortunately, that kind of is the perspective in relation to debt collection. And so as a licensed insolvency trustee, our role is not to collect the debt any more than it is to chase after and collect assets. The role of the licensed insolvency trustee is we could be engaged from you, perhaps as a citizen, saying, hey, listen, I've got too many debt collectors coming after me. I need some assistance in stopping this and getting into a plan to restructure that debt. But you know something, Nam, when it comes to debt collection, it's a very difficult job that those debt collectors are involved in. And sometimes they leave empathy at the door in an effort to sort of protect themselves from the stress of what they're doing.
The numbers that we saw the responses that we saw were about perceptions. How do those perceptions match up to the reality? What are the reasons why people go into debt?
Yeah, the reality is people go into debt for all sorts of different reasons. And usually the difficulty is that it happens in small increments. So notwithstanding that someone can end up owing $48,000, $50,000 in credit card debt, if you were to ask them, how did you get here? They don't really know. It's sort of like you have one drink and then you have another drink and you have another drink. And the next thing you know, you're intoxicated. That's what happens with people getting into debt. Now, Nam, the big difference here is there's debt, and then there's the debt where it's overwhelming, that starts impacting your different parts about your life. So that's where we're starting to look and saying, well, when are they insolvent? And then they start to look for accessing these laws that we assist people to access.
Do you find if there's a generational divide on how we understand what causes personal debt?
Yeah, interestingly, like you were mentioning when you get out of school, the younger generation certainly looks at it and says the older generation was indicating that they believed it was sort of impulse purchases and not being conscious of needs versus wants, where the younger generation was saying, well, wait a second here. It's not just about that. There is financial literacy aspects. So it's interesting that each generation has their different perspective, and I guess that's what makes Canada such a wonderful place, is that diversity of perspectives. The important thing is that we're having these kind of conversations because it's not so much that one perspective is right or wrong. What's important is that those perspectives are shared in a manner in which we're able to educate one another and move to a better place.
The Ontario government has financial literacy where actually it's being taught in schools now. And your report reveals our changing attitudes towards debt. Back in the 1800s, we had debtors' prisons. Historically, how have our perceptions about debt changed?
Well, so I would say that historically, what would occur is, of course, if you were unable to pay your debt, what would happen? Bankruptcy means broken bench. So the creditors would get together, they'd bring a trustee who would come, take the possessions, break the individual's bench, and have them incarcerated. And the only way they'd be out of jail is if they were their friends paid them out. So what ended up happening is, of course, that's not very beneficial to society, as you have someone that's the breadwinner in jail, because it just sort of breaks down. So what we've looked at as a people, we've looked and we've said, no, this needs to be a rehabilitative process. Now, that's different, being that our laws are that way. But as a people, we still sort of look at someone that is insolvent or unable to pay their debts, and we still sort of say, well, hey, you got yourself here. Shame on you for getting here, and you shouldn't be in this situation.
Well, people carry debt on credit cards. 28,000 is the median amount of debt on credit cards that individual Canadians are carrying. As a society, have we normalized carrying debt, or is it just a sign of the times that we live in?
Well, now, I think we've normalized carrying debt. It's just, in a lot of ways, we often will, as people, we're used to carrying debt, but we don't really know how much debt is too much debt. And it's when that moment where you don't feel a sense of financial wellness, right? So one of the things that occurs is that as you put debt onto your credit cards, for example, if you were to get a response when you get your statements back from your creditors, it's going to indicate a certain amount is payable. And that minimum amount, if you pay that, you're never going to be getting out of debt, because it's always going to be going towards the interest as opposed to the principal. I should say a little bit will go towards the principal. Mm-hmm. So what we need to really normalize around is actually the restructuring of that debt, paying it off, not going too far into debt. Or if you find yourself in a place where you can't, that you actually start using our insolvency laws to restructure yourself.
We keep hearing that there is good debt. Is that such a thing?
Well, certainly. I mean, there's everything is sort of moral or neutral in its purpose. So debt allows you, when you're using debt, it's basically trading your future money for what your present desires are. Right. So money, as when we go to the workforce, we trade our current time, we get money, and then we trade that for our desires. Debt or credit is what our future money is. So it's our future desire. So it's a great way to access things. The question is, what are your future desires and what are you looking to achieve? Because often, unfortunately, we're not looking far enough down the road. We're sometimes quite myopic in the use of our credit cards and our debt.
To what extent is the normalizing of debt an issue for us as a society?
I think it's huge. I think it's absolutely huge. It's something that we as a people, it's normal to carry debt, right? But we kind of refer to when we're overburdened by debt as if it's the weather, right? So, when it's freezing cold outside, we kind of hunker down and we say, well, I guess it's just what it is. I have to weigh this out. Now, that's not really the case with debt. In a situation where you've overburdened yourself, there is an ability to restructure and have that debt lowered through our insolvency laws to get to a better place.
There is this idea that it can be very overwhelming, and sometimes you put your head in the sand and just say that it's just going to go away. So if we live in a society where debt is so normalized, how do we know when we've reached a level of debt that is dangerous? Are there markers or a formula for that?
Well, there's certainly, you could look at something like the debt to income ratio. But it's what's interesting about debt and the experience of debt is it's quite a personal experience. So, I've met people, they owe, say, $15,000 and they're completely overwhelmed. It starts impacting their sleeping patterns. It starts impacting their focus on being able to do their job. Their productivity drops down at work, which can lead to disciplinary actions at work and eventual unemployment. So the amount of debt isn't nearly as important as your relationship to that debt. Do you feel like you are in a place where you're achieving your goals in relation to your future? Are you future focused, or are you in this place where you're actually feeling like, well, there is no future? It's like the old bumper stickers back in the 80s, I owe, off to work I go. The reality is that might be a funny bumper sticker, but that's a pretty depressing way to frame your future potential.
And I think that would also make people kind of not want to deal with the issue at hand when you talk about the relationship you have.
Absolutely. You know, when something becomes so overwhelming, one of the things that we want to do is we want to ignore it, right? We think like, okay, I'll deal with this after. I've got these other things that I need to deal with. And the reality is that just grows and grows and grows. So sometimes what we do is we keep it in our peripheral and we think, well, if I just focus on what's in front of me, everything's going to be okay. But in order to have an appropriate life and an appropriate framing of our financial wellness, we actually have to have a full-scope review of where we're going and what we're trying to do.
48% of people in Canada have budgets. Can that help you avoid going into debt?
Oh, 100%. You know, so when it comes to the trouble with this, Nam, is that when we look at something like a budget versus an income and expense statement, they're a little bit different. So so an income and expense statement is actual data, right? So you would say, this is what my income's coming in and this is what my expenses are going out. And that actually is referencing to the past, right? So you would, in order to obtain that information, you have to review what's occurred in the past, or more accurately, what's happening presently. So you're tracking that presently. From there, when you know what those expenses are, then what you do is you say, okay, I would like to adjust these things. And it's that awareness of adjustment that allows you to create that budget. Now, if you just create a budget and say, well, I'm just going to spend, for example, I'm only going to spend $100 on eating out. Well, that might fit very well within a fictional budget. But if you're right now spending $500 a month, what that means is 1 out of the 5 times you would normally do it is when you're able to actually reward yourself with that particular treat.
Wait a minute. Are you in my bank account?
I'm not in your bank account. No. We can't do that. We can't do that. You know that.
When you said, anyway, it's a joke. It's a joke. From what you see day to day as an insolvency trustee, to what extent are people aware that they have a problem before they come to you?
Well, you know, obviously when they come to me, because there's different ways you can end up in restructuring. It could be put upon you from an external factor, like being appointed by the court. Now, that doesn't typically happen in relation to personal insolvency, which is what we focus on. Mm-hmm. When it comes to people being aware of it, they are aware of it. And what they do become aware of, Nam, and this is quite interesting, is that they ought to have been here several years before, because they were aware of it before, but they weren't when I say willing, that's not exactly accurate. They weren't honest enough with themselves to say, no, I need this assistance to move forward. What's important for us to understand is everyone has a part to play in the community. And there's no shame when you need the assistance of professionals within the community. And that's what licensed insolvency trustees are. We're professionals that assist you to access this legislation, to get your debt under control, to get your future back ahead of you.
I can hear people who are watching this or listening to this say, you know, it is your responsibility to not go into debt. We've heard the expression that you're morally bankrupt if you do file for bankruptcy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting. I can't see into your bank account, but you can hear into people's living rooms. So that's a little bit, of course, I'm kidding.
I'm very talented, Sean.
You are very talented. I love TV. So, you know, what I would say to them, it's the old adage, like, walk a mile in someone's shoes before you judge them, right? It's really easy. It's really, really easy to pass judgment on people. And if you take pride in your passing judgment on people, I'm certainly not going to pass judgment on you for that, but I don't think that's how a community is built. Start from a place of empathy. How does this happen, right? Oftentimes what occurs, Nam, is that we as a people believe that our banks and our creditors are not going to allow us to get into a situation where we'll become over our head. And The fact of the matter is that's not the responsibility of the credit grantor. Now, you might say, well, if I can't afford it, they won't loan me the money. And that's true in some cases, right? But it could be the situation that you overburden yourself, because often what we're looking at is we're only looking at that monthly payment, right? So we say, I can afford this monthly payment, so I'll be okay. And then something like maybe a job loss happens, or a global pandemic happens, and then you're not getting the hours that you used to, or you're not getting the income that you used to, and you're in this place. So when those people in the community that say, well, shame on you for getting in debt, I would say to them, shame on you for passing judgment on your fellow citizens.
Speaking of the pandemic, have you noticed an increase of people filing for insolvency since the pandemic began?
Super interesting question. So what's happened over the years is insolvencies have increased. So bankruptcies have gone down, and consumer proposals, which is a type of restructuring under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, they've gone up. But as the pandemic hit, insolvencies actually dropped. So last year, I believe it was about a 30% drop from the year prior. Now, you would think, well, that would suggest that everyone's doing a lot better. Actually is not at all. Those people that should have been filing last year weren't, because there wasn't that external pressure of the, you'd mentioned earlier about the collector calling you, right? So because that collection activity hasn't happened, people haven't been moving forward with filing their insolvencies. So it's very likely, as things get normalized again and the banks start their collection activities, it's going to be coming back, and it's going to be so much more insolvencies coming down the road.
Some people might say that being able to declare bankruptcy encourages that. Should we be careful about the degree to which it is easy or difficult to declare bankruptcy?
Yeah, again, I think that perspective, and it is a perspective, and I'd never shame someone on what their perspective is, but it is missing a major component. So what's important for us to understand as people is that in life we have promises and we have predictions, right? And every promise that we make is predicated on certain things happening. So for example, the show today, it's promised that, hey, it's going to happen at this time, and this is what's going to happen. But if something occurs that there has to be a shift in this, part of being in a community is to recognize that not all promises need to always be held to that same account. So what we need to understand as citizens, and those citizens that are judging the other citizens that are utilizing these laws, is that these are not new laws. The Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act is 100 years old this year. And the creditors that loan money are very aware of this, right? And they charge interest to offset the potentiality of these debts going bad and being uncollectible. Now, for those that say, okay, fine, Sean, that's the law, but what about the moral aspect of something like this? What I would suggest is, again, it would go back to watch your judgments of people, because walk in their shoes before you start passing those judgments. And I'll tell you something, Nam, when you do a restructuring, you're required to do a couple counseling sessions under the tutelage of the trustee. And it talks about money management and consumption habits and the warning signs of financial difficulty, and it helps us get to that better place.
We have about 30 seconds left. By looking forward, how do we get to a world where people don't have to go into debt just to survive?
Well, I think one day we might be able to get to a place where we have the universal income. I think CERB's been really beneficial for Canadians to get to that better place. But I don't know that we're ever going to get out of debt. I think it's going to be kind of part of what our community is all about. So really, it's about normalizing the ability to restructure that debt so we can get to a better place and take away that sort of stigma and shame for people.
Sean, thank you so much for your insights. We really, really do appreciate you making time for us. I've been admiring the plants behind your back. Very nice. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Vaccines, employment benefits, and business support don't come cheap. It's been over a year of massive spending by our governments to keep us afloat in the midst of a global pandemic. The result? Record debts and soaring deficits. And the billion-dollar question is, who is going to pay for it? Joining us now with their thoughts in Kitchener, Tammy Sherrill, Professor of Economics at Wilfrid Laurier University, and in Toronto, in Ontario's capital city, economist Jeff Rubin, author of The Expandables: How the Middle Class Got Screwed by globalization, and April Franco, Associate Professor of Economics at U of T, with a cross appointment to the Economic Analysis and Policy area at Rotman School of Management. It's very nice to meet all of you. Welcome. I said it was a billion-dollar question, but I think it's probably more accurate to call it a trillion-dollar question. To help set our discussion for tonight, let's take a look at some of the numbers that came out of the province's $186 billion 2021 budget that was recently tabled by Finance Minister Peter Bethlenflawy. Ontario saw a record $38.5 billion deficit through 2020. The ministry forecasts a deficit of about $33.1 billion for the 2021-22 fiscal year. Ontario's economy shrunk by about 5.7% over the last year, and it will take at least until 2029 for Ontario to balance the books, and that's at least. I wanted to get from all of you, when you see those numbers and those scenarios, what comes to mind? Jeff, I'll start with you.
Well, you mentioned Ontario. Ontario's gone relatively unscathed compared to Ottawa. We've seen the federal deficit explode by 10 times pre-COVID levels. There's been a over 50% increase in public debt. The key point that I think people have to realize is that while there's a cyclical component to this deficit, while some of these programs, spending programs, will be discontinued, the enormity of this deficit means that we will not be able to grow ourselves out of it, that it will take very, very significant fiscal action. And no matter who is in power after the election, we're facing huge spending cuts and we're facing huge tax increases. That's a given. On whose shoulders those tax increases are going to be placed, well, that's to be determined, and I guess that's the choice to be made.
Tammy, it's interesting what Jeff just said, because I don't know if I've heard any politician mention taxes, but I wanted to get your reaction to those numbers.
So I think there's two really important points here, and I think I might differ from some others. The first is that we have to make a clear distinction between provincial debt and federal debt. From all estimates I've seen, the federal debt is quite sustainable, and I don't think there's any really big concerns there yet. But provincially, our debt was a problem before this pandemic hit us. We were running into huge problems with unsustainable debt. And so that's the bigger concern moving forward. The other point is that the deficits that we see this year and over the next couple of years, this isn't just going on a splurge. This is looking at over 1 million people in Ontario who lost their jobs last spring, and they needed support for that. And that's the kind of thing that we're carrying forward. And that's very different when we think about lost tax revenues and the spending, as opposed to just something we'd like to do.
April, this has been called a once-in-a-lifetime event, and when it comes to the government, it's kind of they have to think about the now, and thinking about the future maybe not the priority. I'm not saying that's how it should be, but when you look at those numbers, what goes through your mind?
Well, there's a couple points. First, I want to point out that governments can borrow at a much cheaper rate than individuals can. So anytime the government borrows, it's borrowing at an interest rate that is significantly lower than what individuals can do. And so that means that, the government is the one that needs to borrow when we have these cataclysmic events that occur. In terms of getting out of the debt, one thing that we know as economists that we can get out of this debt is because we have economic growth. As long as we can produce, entrepreneurs can come in and come up with those great new ideas and grow, that's how we're going to get out of this. We're
going to talk about that in a little bit. But Jeff, when you look around the world,
you said we could challenge what each other says.
Sure.
I very much would challenge the notion that the federal deficit is anywhere close, remotely close, to being sustainable. It's only sustainable if the Bank of Canada continues to buy $4 billion of bonds every week and $350 billion worth of debt every year. But many people, particularly those who come from a capital markets background, and I spent the better part of 20 years being the chief economist of an investment bank in Canada, where I would go around the world trying to place these bonds. If the Bank of Canada stops doing that, this federal deficit is unsustainable. And the people who are going to feel that the most are people who will have to be renegotiating their mortgage rate.
But what is the choice for the government?
What is the choice for the government? As I said, you can't grow your way out of this deficit. We're back where Paul Martin was in the mid-1990s. There's going to have to be some very tough fiscal action, spending cuts and tax increases. And then the question becomes, who's going to bear the burden of this? You know, when it comes to devising trade policies, the middle class is irrelevant. But when it comes to paying down huge deficits, the middle class is always uppermost in the government's minds. It's middle class households who are going to bear this burden unless we choose to place it on other people's shoulders. Chrystia Freeland wrote a book on plutocrats. Let's see if she follows through with that as the finance minister and places some of the burden on them. Because you know what? The 1%, the Sobeys, the Westons, they've weathered this pandemic very well. Sales in pharmacies, sales in grocery stores have been soaring. Let them bear some of this burden so that it doesn't singularly have to fall on the shoulders of Canada's dwindling middle class.
Well, Jeff, since you brought this up, you know, millions of Canadians have lost their jobs since the pandemic began, but Canada's 44 billionaires increased their wealth by almost $63.5 billion. The charity Oxfam estimates this would be enough to give every one of the 3.8 million poorest people in Canada a check for $16,823. April, you know, should billionaires be made to pay for their fair share?
So, you know, I think that there is some rationale behind making sure that the burden is shared a little bit more evenly. But there is always a problem with that, with taxes. Anytime you try and tax somebody who is wealthy, who has income that can be moved from one jurisdiction to another, you have to worry about them doing exactly that. So, you know, money is fungible. You can move it across borders. It's really easy. People with income who earn their income from labor, that is a different piece. It might be harder for you to move your work to a jurisdiction that has a lower tax rate. And so I do think that we have to be a little bit cognizant of these issues. And so while, you know, what Jeff is pointing out is an important piece, we also have to worry about making sure that we are creating a tax system that will actually create taxes by not creating one where people want to move so that they can escape the taxes.
Let me push back on this a little bit. I'll use the example of Amazon. We know that through the pandemic, Jeff Bezos has become very, very wealthy. In the GTA, the Amazon warehouse, I think, was responsible for maybe 600 COVID cases. One of the things that we've been hearing throughout the pandemic is that Ontarians need sick days. So, could there be, you know, we keep talking about there is no wealth without health. This pandemic has taught us that there is no health without wealth. Could there be a way maybe to legislate companies like Amazon who finesse their way through paying taxes, maybe make them pay for sick days? That way they're contributing to the economy in a way that it doesn't have a ripple effects throughout the province. What do you think about that, April?
So I think that that's an interesting, and I think one that's not, you know, one that's viable in the following sense. The Amazon workers that are working here in Canada that are at the warehouse, those guys we can actually control, and their work is specifically for this area. In other words, if Amazon were to move that warehouse to another jurisdiction where they didn't have those sick days, well, they couldn't deliver it to us. And so the benefit, so moving that is really costly for Amazon. So I think that that's one place where we could actually see something like that.
And Tammy, what do you think?
Well, I think it's important to think that there's two parts to this. There's the job protection that comes with being able to take sick leave, and then there's being able to take that sick leave with pay. Right now, the federal government is offering some support in that regard, but it's really hard if you're just needing to take a day or two off. Can we get employers to pay for that? Certainly. Other jurisdictions do that. It's certainly feasible to do. I think that is one thing that we should consider more. There are general studies showing that when you offer paid sick leave, people will use it well. It reduces rates of, flu in workplaces and other such things, and it could certainly be important in the future.
Jeff, when we do talk about how Canada is faring globally, how does Canada's economy in terms of where we stand with our debt and deficits compare to other countries?
Look, this is a universal problem, but proportionally speaking, in terms of both the deficit and the borrowing requirements, no one comes close to us in the G7. Now, what viewers have to understand is that we have not seen the market impact of all of this borrowing, because the Bank of Canada has basically financed this deficit. They've increase their holdings of Government of Canada bonds to over 40% of the entire market. Should they stop doing this, we would see a very dramatic rise in bond yields, the same bond yields that mortgage rates are priced off. Thank God I locked in to a 5-year fixed term mortgage at below 2% in September, because if the Bank of Canada stops buying all of these bonds, bond yields and mortgage rates could well be a multiple of what they are. And that's in the past what the cost of running these huge fiscal deficits is. Borrowing rates skyrocket. And not just the federal government's borrowing rates, your borrowing rates. Do you want to continue to bet home ownership on the Bank of Canada continuing to do something that they've never done before? And I would argue what the Bank of Canada is doing is ultimately unsustainable. And when that becomes unsustainable, mortgage holders are going to recognize that in a hurry. If the Bank of Canada is really serious about cooling off the housing market, all they got to do is stop buying $4 billion worth of bonds every week, and rising mortgage rates will do the job. Of course, if Tiff Macklem did that, he'd probably get fired.
April,
So
when you look, go ahead. Yeah.
In this moment there, one thing that I think is really important, Jeff, is that we're not talking about continuing this kind of borrowing for years. We're talking about this being a once in a lifetime event where we have to get into this position, which is not great for us. And you're right that it's not going to be great for our kids either, but this is the only way that we could get out of this pandemic.
But April, this isn't a one-time. If the deficit magically disappeared next year, then the Bank of Canada wouldn't have to be buying $4 billion worth of bonds a week. The problem is, as I said at the beginning, we can't just grow our way out of this deficit. This deficit is going to be here for a while. And during that time, unless we want to have 3 times the interest rates that we currently have, this deficit is going to continue to have to be financed by the Bank of Canada. And I suspect that this will not end well for either Tiff Macklem or the Bank of Canada, but more importantly, this won't end well ultimately for homeowners, because they will ultimately bear the financial burden of all of this government borrowing.
Vaccines have been said to be the game changer and maybe something that will make the pandemic go away. Truth be told, we don't know when this pandemic is going to go away. We don't know what we're going to need in 6 months, if we're going to need booster shots, et cetera. Tammy, I know you wanted to weigh in on this.
Well, certainly we don't know exactly where things are going. When we think about interest rates and everything else, all these different moving parts, I haven't seen good reason to think that we're heading back into the 1990s. Things look very different today than they did then. And when it comes to employment recovering, we expect that once those vaccines are rolled out, people can get back to work. In things like accommodation and food services, we tend to think of employment there as being fairly elastic in the sense that people are quickly laid off, but those businesses quickly bounce back as well. I'm a bit more concerned about things like arts and entertainment, where customers have found other things to do. They've given up their season tickets. They might not come back to those businesses as quickly. And so we're going to have to wait and see how that's going. I think a lot of those groups are going to have to restructure, and a lot of those workers are going to be looking for something new to do.
We're going to touch on that in just a moment, but I wanted to read you all this, something from The Economist, and this was from March 25th. And they write, COVID-19 means there is more red ink to come. A new era of sovereign debt management could be about to begin. What this period may bring is not yet clear. The post-pandemic debt regime might resemble that of the immediate post-war era. The trials of this crisis could inspire a new wave of investment in technology and infrastructure, leading to fierce competition for available savings and higher government borrowing costs. It's been said, never waste a good crisis. Who here is optimistic about a new wave of investment in technology and infrastructure?
Oh, absolutely. I think that this is going to be the big thing. The question is, it's hard for us at this point in time to really have a sense of what that invention or innovation is going to be. I think that we're going to see a lot more quick tests for all sorts of things, not just the COVID-19, but for a lot of things, so that now we are protecting workers as they walk through the door and making sure that nobody is getting sick. So I think that that's going to be one thing. And I think the other thing is we've already seen with technology like Zoom and Skype and, how many people are talking to their friends and family every day on these systems. And so I think we're going to see a great amount of innovation here.
And Tammy, in what ways could this crisis inspire new ways of approaching debt?
In terms of debt, I think the one thing that we need to be most concerned about is what happens with personal income tax revenues in the near future and how that's going to move forward. In terms of taking on debt, I think we've seen two groups over this past year. There's, families like mine that have been staying at home and not spending as much. We have some pent-up savings that need somewhere to go. And then there's the group of people who were laid off for large parts of the year, and they've had good income support that's kept them going. Some of them have been able to reduce their debt loads, and that might be some advantage in moving forward as well.
You're all economists. Yes, go ahead, Jeff.
Something I'd just like to amplify that Tammy pointed out that I think is very important, and I'd be very optimistic about, the personal savings rate. The personal savings rate in Canada, and it'd be the same in the U.S., is about 4 times what it normally would be. That's not because people didn't want to spend. That's because people couldn't spend. What you're seeing in the stock market right now is a huge shift of funds out of tech stocks into the so-called cyclicals. There's going to be an enormous surge in consumer demand when we reopen the economy. Now, granted, that's going to be tied to the pace of inoculation, but in the U.S., where things are opening up, we're seeing that people are lined up outside of Nordstrom Rack to go shopping because they haven't bought clothes in a year. So I think we're all going to be pleasantly surprised by the strength of the consumer rebound, because there is an incredible amount of pent-up demand, whether it's to go to a theater or to buy clothes or to go to a restaurant. And I think we're going to find that consumption's very, very strong, stronger than probably most people initially suspect right now.
Just to build on what Jeff said, April, once we do get out and we start spending, and once that's out of our system, to what degree can that stave off economic decline?
I think we are going to be back. So there's been a lot of work recently trying to understand what the rebound is going to be. Is it going to be V-shaped, or is it going to be more slow? And I think that my expectation is that we'll see a much more V-shaped response, that we're going to see people come back, and it's going to be back to what levels that we've seen in the past very quickly. So, I think that that's going to be what's going to drive a lot of this.
Tammy, you mentioned the entertainment sector, the service sector. To what extent can those who lost all those jobs in the service sector, restaurants, and the arts and entertainment bounce back after this pandemic?
Well, that's to be seen. I think there's different groups here. So you see a lot of industries that are operating at normal levels. They might be operating differently, working out of people's homes and such, but they're working and they're fine. Things like restaurants, your hospitality and tourism, they're going to be struggling for a little while to bounce back, but I think they can bounce back quickly. We've seen that in the past. We've seen that in the data over the past year. I'm very optimistic they're going to make it back very quickly. There's these pockets, though, of industries and different groups of people where we think they're going to struggle a little bit more.
Like what?
I'd expect a little bit more struggle in the arts and entertainment. We're very concerned that there's pockets of single moms out there who had to give up on working in the past year. We're concerned also that we've seen some preliminary evidence of more people with more seniority in their companies. They haven't gotten recalled to work as quickly as some of their junior counterparts. And so we're a bit concerned about long-term joblessness in those groups. So I think going forward, I'm optimistic for the big picture in terms of everyone getting back to work quickly, including in hospitality and tourism. But there's these pockets of people we're going to have to watch out for.
And Jeff, we've been I think before we were taping, we were talking about how the concern for the younger generation and how they're going to be shouldered with this debt. You've mentioned the middle class. But something that we've been talking about on the show a lot is that if we found any silver linings, I think the pandemic has shown the inequality in our society. But do you see any silver linings? Will workers have jobs? Maybe if we can address protectionism. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I do. It's an ironic one, but it's a silver lining nevertheless. History is showing that pandemics, going back to the bubonic plague, Spanish flu, in their wake, wages have always risen. Now, wages rose after pandemics simply because of the physical decimation of the labor force. There were less peasants, less workers available, so hence the price of labor rose. I think we're also going to see wages rise, not because, hopefully, of the physical decimation of the labor force, but trade policies have changed. Trade policies that have been immiserizing to the middle class in Canada and the United States and the UK have changed. And, I haven't noticed Joe Biden take off any of the tariffs that Donald Trump slapped on China. I think this is a different trading regime. I think the pandemic has dealt a mortal blow to global supply chains and globalization. And I think the repatriation of long lost middle class manufacturing jobs is going to see wages grow, so that in the wake of this pandemic, like in past pandemics, we're going to see a welcome rise in wages.
We have about 5 minutes.
I think silver lining.
We have about 5 minutes, and there's a few more questions I want to get through with all of you. You're all economists. If we look at some basic economic theories, I'd like to get your thoughts on where these numbers are heading with interest rates, inflation rates, and unemployment rates. Tammy, I'll start with you. Unemployment rates.
So right now in Ontario, there's about 300,000 or more people who should be working who aren't. And we have over 800,000 people using employment insurance right now. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the existing problem as it is right now and what we have going forward. I think that can recover fairly quickly, but like I said, we have to watch out for these pockets of people. We have young people trying to start careers. We have new moms trying to make their way back into the labor market. And then all of these folks who have been laid off for a large part of the past year trying to make their way back in. It's going to take a little bit of time. I'm optimistic that we're going to get there quickly. But an important thing here is recognizing that this is not like past recessions. Past recessions, we really focused on the goods market. We'd throw stimulus spending at construction and manufacturing, worrying about those jobs. This recession is about the service sector, and that takes a very different approach.
And Tammy, April, inflation rates.
So, I don't think the inflation rate is going to go up. I think, the central banks around the world are very well versed in how to manage that. And so I don't expect it to go up dramatically. And I think that for the same reason that we're not seeing interest rates going up. And even if, as my colleague said, interest rates could be 3 times what they are now, think about what that is. When I was in graduate school, my interest rate on my student loan was in the double digits. 3 times what the interest rate is now is like 6%. That's not even close. So, we have been there. And I do think that the central banks are very well versed in how to manage this.
Well, you led me right to Jeff. Jeff, interest rates, your thoughts?
Well, if interest rates are 5 or 6%, there are going to be hundreds of thousands of Canadians who aren't going to be able to afford their home. And as I said at the beginning, record low interest rates and record high deficits is a marriage that cannot last. I would urge any viewer who has not yet locked in to a fixed term mortgage to do so now, because we are not growing our way out of these deficits, and the Bank of Canada will not be able to indefinitely buy $4 billion worth of bonds every week. So that's my takeaway. Lock in now and immunize yourself from what, unfortunately, the government of Canada will not be able to do, which is ultimately soaring public debt charges.
I locked in a year ago. And Tammy, moving forward, would protectionism be a good thing for Canada and Ontario's economy?
So I'll start by giving a shout out to my colleagues at the Finances of the Nation. Everyone should check out their estimates on debt and debt sustainability. I think that's a useful site. When it comes to protectionism, that's not a winner in the long run. We can see some short-term gains within pockets of industries that are protected, but in the long run, that's going to cost everyone in Canada even more. And so I tend not to encourage people to go down that road.
April, small businesses have really struggled this past year. If they are still here, there's very few of them. How can the small business sector move forward?
I think that what we've learned is being able to pivot and really find something that customers are willing and able to use, even when we are stuck all locked at home, right? So a lot of restaurants, the ones that have been very successful, have pivoted to delivery, to these, sort of meal kits kind of things. And they have still managed. One thing that I think is going to be very interesting moving forward is whether they're going to pivot back to the restaurant full service. I mean, I think many of us who have been stuck at home are thinking, of course I want full service. Like, I don't want somebody else to do my dishes. I don't care about being at my home in the 4 walls that we've all been in. But I do think that, being able to pivot, because the restaurants, a lot of these restaurants rent huge spaces with lots and lots of tables and have to have the staff, the busboys, the waiters, the hostess, all of those people. And what I think we're realizing is that there is another way of doing this that's a little bit cheaper and, can give them a little bit more of the profits as well. Now, how do we do that? I don't know. We'll see what happens in the future. But I do think that there's a lot going on there.
I'm going to give you all 10 seconds each for the next question, and then we need to wrap up. If you were in charge, give me one fiscal policy you would put in place to help create a robust and sustainable economy moving forward. Jeff, 10 seconds.
Impose an inheritance tax on estates over $5 million and make all of capital gains inclusive, taxable, no tax on home ownership.
And Tammy?
We need childcare infrastructure and the proper spaces being built. That's going to get parents back to work and pay more taxes again.
And April?
Childcare. Being able to go out and work is really important. And we've already seen that this has been so unequal in terms of women, the effect on women and the effect on people who have small children at home. Not having childcare and not offering it to everyone is really important.
Big thank you to all of you. I feel a lot smarter after speaking to you for this past half hour. Thank you very much for your insights. We really do appreciate you taking the time for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin have been making headlines over the past few months. But do we know how they work? Here is a crash course explainer in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. Whether or not you follow the stock market closely, you have probably heard about the recent surge and fall of cryptocurrency. Earlier this year, one Bitcoin's value topped $40,000 US for the first time ever. But a mere 2 weeks later, Bitcoin slipped by more than 20%. Soon there were stories of Bitcoin users who lost their passwords to their digital wallets, losing out on potentially millions of dollars. And here in Ontario, one court has been mulling over the idea of whether shares in Bitcoin should be considered in a divorce settlement. That volatility has brought up a lot of questions. How does Bitcoin work? Is it too late to get into the market? And for a lot of people, what in the heck is cryptocurrency? In 2009, Bitcoin, the first cryptocurrency, was born. Bitcoin is digital, meaning there's no physical coin you can touch or hold. But it is different from the digital money you spend shopping online. Bitcoin is what is known as a decentralized digital currency. That means there are no banks, government, or other intermediaries overseeing these transactions.
If you go to your bank and you see the balance on your accounts, that's basically like a bank ledger. The bank knows how much money each person holds in their accounts. The problem with this is that you trust the bank to be accurate, to maintain this, and to be accountable. When you have something like a blockchain, now that trust is redistributed between multiple parties.
Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies run on blockchain technology. Think of blockchain as a database. Information is stored in blocks. This includes things like transfers and purchases. Once a block is full, it is linked to the previous block, creating a chain. All the blocks are connected chronologically, creating a chain that started in 2009 and continues to this day.
Most of the time, it's completely auditable. It's fully open and transparent like Bitcoin. You can see the ledger. As long as you have an internet connection, you can download that distributed database, and you can see every single thing that has happened on Bitcoin since day one.
So why does Bitcoin have value? The simple answer is people give it that value. They trust it. Currency can take many forms, but the properties of what is known as sound money are universal. Divisibility, durability, recognizability, portability, and scarcity. When we talk about the divisibility of fiat currency like Canadian dollars, we know that $1 can be broken into 100 cents. In comparison, a Satoshi is the smallest unit of a Bitcoin, equivalent to 100 millionth of a Bitcoin. Unlike Canadian dollars, which are printed through the Bank of Canada, there is a limit on how many Bitcoins are available in the market. Only 21 million Bitcoins will ever be produced. Now, there are two popular ways of acquiring Bitcoin. You can purchase them online or at one of the 11,000 Bitcoin ATMs across Canada. Or you can do what is known as mining. No, you won't be needing a helmet and chisel for this type of excavating, but rather a powerful computer.
Mining was designed as an incentive for people to upkeep the Bitcoin network.
The concept of mining isn't all that different from mining gold. As you help process transactions on the blockchain, you are rewarded with coins. Back in 2009, a miner was rewarded 50 Bitcoins for every block they produce. However, Bitcoin goes through what is known as a halving cycle. In other words, the amount of Bitcoin released into the world is cut in half every 4 years. This cut in supply can help explain the volatility of Bitcoin's value in the first months of 2021. Today, a miner is rewarded only 6.25 coins for every block they process.
So when you think about it like that, Bitcoin actually goes through a pretty interesting cycle in the market where every 4 years, that supply gets cut in half, and it obviously messes with the economics of it because now it becomes much more scarce.
One of the biggest advantages of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin is that you can send large sums of money halfway across the world in a matter of 10 minutes. But what can you buy with it? While still limited, you can buy fast food, a hot cup of coffee, plane tickets to your next vacation, tickets to concerts and sporting events. More recently, Tesla announced it would start accepting Bitcoin as a payment method for its products after buying $1.5 billion US in Bitcoin. Bitcoin was created by Satoshi Nakamoto. The name is a pseudonym, and Bitcoin's partial anonymity is both an appeal and a concern.
All kinds of information is captured on there, the date and time that the transaction occurred, whose address it was sent by, and to the address it was received. But there's only one piece of important information that's not held within there, and that who is the holder of the account.
As cryptocurrencies have become more popular, so have the scams related to them.
What they're asking for is for Bitcoin in lieu. And so one of the most popular ones that we're seeing here in Canada is the CRA scam, where a fraudster will contact somebody, usually via the telephone, and they'll basically scare them into sending payment to them unless or else suffer, time in jail.
According to Chainalysis, criminal activity accounted for only 2.1% of all cryptocurrency transactions. However, that figure accounts for a whopping $21 billion US in transfers. While Bitcoin is the most popular of cryptocurrencies, there are over 8,000 different cryptocurrencies out there today.
Just make sure that you do your research and that you develop an understanding of what cryptocurrency is, the methods of acquiring it, and who those players are, and make sure that you're dealing with somebody who's reputable.
Although Bitcoin was originally conceived as something that would become a convenient currency, its role has evolved.
It is sort of changed over time to become more of a store of value and hedging against stuff like inflation.
This technology is not going anywhere. We expect it to be around forever. I mean, it's actually kind of exciting to be a part of it and see it grow over time.
It just becomes a good form of digital gold at the end of the day, more so than it is actually a day-to-day transaction currency.
That is the agenda for Monday, April 5th, 2021. Kids across the province are looking forward to summer camp. Tomorrow, Steve checks in on the odds of them getting to go. Also, we'll assess the promise and the reality of e-learning. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and Steve will see you tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman. And by viewers like you. Thank you.